Hello, everyone at home and in the room. It's great to see so many people attending online and offline. This is our second seminar of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab for this spring / summer 2022. I am Michele Lancione. I'm full professor of geography at the Polytechnic of Turin, and I have the great pleasure to be sitting close to Wangui Kimari, who has joined us from Kenya. So thank you, Wangui, for being here. I'm just going to say 1 or 2 words about the lab. This is a space that we co-created with Abdulmalik Simon, who is online, and it aims to speak around the shifting terrain of inhabitation globally. It's underpinned by a big European Research Council project that looks specifically at housing struggle and the struggle for just housing in many different contexts around the world. And the lab is a bigger umbrella for this project. We have an exciting steering committee of which Wangui is part of. And our idea is to engage in a series of conversations with people interested in terms of housing and inhabitation. With Malik, we want for this lab to be a collective study lab, which means that the lab is not driven by attaining further funding, it's not driven by having to publish at all costs, it's driven by the need and the willingness to engage in conversations across geographies on the aforementioned themes. So our seminar series is part of this aim, if you want. And I also want to say thank you, just a couple of thank you to the people that made this series possible. And in particular today, I want to thank Dr. Reina Rusenko, who is going to look at the chat. So if you have comments about Wangui's presentation, you can leave a comment in the chat. We will give you the word afterwards. I also want to thank Dr. Oluwafemi Olajide, who will come here in a second to introduce Wangui. And also thank you to Daniela Morpurgo, Dr. Daniela Morpurgo, who created a beautiful poster for this talk, and Dr. Chiara Cacciotti, who helped a lot in order to bring Wangui here physically today. And I also want to mention that this is possible because of European Research Council funding. So without further ado, I will ask Oluwafemi to come here to say a couple of words about Wangui, and then we will leave it to you.
Thank you everyone for coming, and it's a pleasure to have Wangui in the house to present our second seminar. So very briefly, I will introduce her. She's done a whole lot of things, but I'll just summarize what she's been doing. So it's really a great pleasure. So Wangui is a research fellow at the Institute of Humanity in Africa at the University of Cape Town. So since I'm an anthropologist, our work draws on many local histories and theoretical approaches, including oral narratives, assemblage theory, urban political ecology, the Black radical tradition, the anthropology of empire, the anthropology of violence, and the anthropology of subjectivity, in order to think through urban spatial management in Nairobi from the vantage point of its most marginalized residents. Wangui is also the Participatory Action Regions Coordinator for the Marari Social Justice Center, a community-based organization in Marari, a poor urban settlement in Nairobi, Kenya, and an editorial board member of the online publication, Africa is a Country. Please join me to welcome Wangui as we take the stage to present our seminar.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope there's not too much of, anyways, back sound. So again, thank you everyone for coming today, both at home and here. Thank you so much, Michele and your team, for the invite and the opportunity to be part of this ongoing collaboration. So my talk today, like I was saying, is called We Are All Taxonomists, Vernaculars of Geological Time from Southern Margins. And again, it's a very cryptic title, I apologize. But what I'm trying to do, I hope will be evident soon. And this piece is also a work in progress. And it's informed by thinking I've been trying to do recently around the Anthropocene, which is kind of a newish word for me, I guess a newish word for most people. It's officially, I think, affirmed as a geological age in 2016. But it's also a word we don't use so much in Kenya. But it doesn't mean, even if we don't use the Anthropocene, that people are not living extinctions on a daily basis, end times on a daily basis, ends of lines of descent. And I think it was important to mention the recent events in Melilla as one example of this. And so even if people don't use the Anthropocene every day, they're living these extinctions. And my argument is, because of this, they can offer more situated ways of narrativizing this crisis, if the Anthropocene is a crisis, using their own words and vernaculars that both connect, but also disconnect from global articulations of environmental change and recent epochal shifts. So what I'm trying to do is to perhaps vernacularize the Anthropocene, or I'm not sure whether it's to anthropogenize the vernacular, one of the two, I'm trying to figure it out. But ultimately, I want to think about how Kenyans, particularly those from what I call outlaw spaces in Nairobi. Sorry, it's not working. Just want to go down.
We have multiple issues.
That's okay. So I'll just continue while we get this slide. So I want to think about how Kenyans, particularly those from what I call outlaw spaces, recognize the environmental crises that is referenced by the Anthropocene, how they apprehend it, how they historicize it, how they respond to it in ways that understanding of the power that reproduce it, but also their determinations, small, imperfect, minimal, to reshape these powers. And personally, I don't need to be about forcing from very, very overcalculated academics, and so it didn't fall into my thinking again. I was going to it's working there. Okay, perfect.
I'm sorry.
No, it's not at all.
It's a polytechnic.
It's no problem. So what I guess what I'm seeing there is, anyway, I'll do this to make sure that we're seeing the same screen. No problem. And so I'll just start a bit earlier. So what I'm trying to do here is to vernacularize the Anthropocene, or maybe try and anthropogenize the vernacular. I'm not sure yet, but what I want to do is think about how Kenyans, particularly those from what I call outlaw spaces in Nairobi, recognize the environmental crises that's referenced by the Anthropocene, and in ways that show, how they apprehend it, how they historicize it, and how they respond to it in ways that show their understandings of the powers and histories that reproduce it, but also their determination, small, imperfect, liminal, to reshape these powers. So in thinking about these local vernaculars of the present moment, I'm inspired by the practices of many people, including the one who gave me the title of the talk, and I'll come to him shortly, in a little bit. And he gave me this title during a focus group where I was asking about ecology in this settlement here in Mathare, and what it meant in this community, what ecology meant, and what living in times of crisis meant in this community. And this is a community where much of my understandings about the coloniality of urban space in Nairobi have been formed. So against this preamble, what I would like to do in this conversation is, what I would like to try and do is three things. So think the Anthropocene through references to everyday environmental connections and emergencies from outlaw spaces, the margins of the margins in Nairobi, and ultimately just think about the different biomaterial ways that this crisis is registered here. Secondly, I would like to illustrate how listening to these stories of outlaw inhabitations of crises can insert spaces and times, materialities and temporalities, spirits and non-spirits, not considered by the more popular discussions of the Anthropocene. Finally, what I would also like to do is highlight how even if Africans and many indigenous people are often on the hinterlands of mainstream Anthropocenic imaginations and discussions, the narratives told from these outlaw spaces reinserts their centrality as not only a key locus around which anthropogenic signatures have been launched, regardless of when you put the start date of the Anthropocene. I also want to show how that where they are key sites to elucidate the necropolitical nature of these processes in the past and present, while offering situated vernaculars to account for these signatures but above all, to reach beyond it because often discussions of the Anthropocene are often declarations of end times or foreclosed futurity. And so I want to show how these vernaculars reach beyond these end times. So here I'm not interested in offering a meta-narrative or a meta-vocabulary. I think there are already everyone almost and their mom has a new name for the Anthropocene. So I don't want to give a new vocabulary, rather like a new meta name, but rather I would like to indicate how these local and translocal understandings of the processes referred to by the Anthropocene in this context, in the words of Lancione and Simoni, animate and articulate a tempo beyond resilience. And for the outlaws I reference, I would like to indicate how they pursue a specific design for their politics of imagination. So in summary, I have three intentions, and I hope the audio is better for everyone. So I have three intentions: to think the Anthropocene through the outlaws of Nairobi, to seek to expand the inclusiveness of what is not considered in this geological age, or what is registered as an environment or an ecological signature is different in another space. And three, to indicate how the Anthropocene has not foreclosed actions for life or life force, even for those who continue to reel from its violence. And towards this, I make a proposition, building on my interlocutor's words, that we are all taxonomists. By taking the power to name, not necessarily to order or to categorize, but to name, we can seek to inhabit and reinscribe different futures than those said to be designated in strata. So that's my preamble. Let's see if I can go to page down. So that's Madare again. There's a Gikuyu proverb, and Gikuyu are an ethnic group in Kenya, that says, neither the earth nor the sky know what the other will do. So in Gikuyu, that's Vena Iguru Itimenyaga. This is a situated aphorism that seeks to convey in epigrammatic cultural terms that none of us can really predict what can happen at any time, and our lives must make room for this unpredictability. But even while cognizant of this variability of everyday life, we also know that the things that are happening in our environment now are not just the articulations of an uncertain relationship between the earth and the sky. In Kenya, Anthropocenic signatures are everywhere. The El Molo, one of the smallest communities in the country, have had their village split in two by the rising water levels of Lake Turkana, the largest desert lake in the world. As a consequence, burial sites have been washed away, jeopardizing cultural rights and sites that will no longer convey or no longer support either genealogies or ontologies. In addition, close to 4 million people will go hungry this year, almost a tenth of our population, as drought continues to be a national disaster. In Nairobi, air pollution abounds, and it is at a level that is 70% higher than what the World Health Organization considers safe, prompting close to 20,000 deaths a year, a third of which are of children. One of the leading contributors to this pollution is, of course, the extremely high lead fuel that, while not seen as fit for anywhere else, is sold and deemed fit for Africa. In what are considered the knowledge centers of the world, read Europe, North America, the material effects of this produced materiality beyond what we know about the relationship between the earth and sky is referred to as the Anthropocene, a geological age launched by the unsustainable machinations of humans. But if nomenclatures do political work, as Gabriel Hedge says, like much of what counts as knowledge, the Anthropocene as a term has not put in the labor to count politically in the geographies where its effects are intensified, even if these are the regions least responsible for what is considered our present geological time, and even if these populations have not always been considered humans. Oops, sorry. Critical interventions have been put forward to highlight and to remedy this. For example, that we should interrogate the racialized psychic life of geology, Yusuf says this, towards recognizing that decolonization is also a geological project. Others say that we should foreground the analysis of global environmental change put forward by its prime victims, Burgess, for example, and that those suffering the worst effects of the devastating gendered, racialized, ecological manifestations of capitalism and imperialism should be at the forefront of talking about environmental change. There are also others related who say that we need to rename this geological age to more explicitly reference the violent historical processes that brought it into being. My contribution is not to rehash these interventions, but hopefully to build on them, informed by the everyday praxis of many Kenyans. I build on situated elaborations of our present moment towards upholding local references for our Anthropocenes, and I say this in plural intentionally, in a bid to allow us to move beyond shallow historicizations. In particular, while I reference anthropogenic signatures across the country, I focus on margins within the margins, poor urban settlements in Nairobi that I dub outlaw spaces, which in my own work reference spaces that are consistently outlawed, so always criminalized, people are always arrested and detained, but spaces that don't have recourse to the law or are outside of the law to rally against the violence that is both fast and slow, violence like that of the Anthropocene. I focus on the inhabitations of these margins because it is in places like this where the metabolisms of racial capitalism, extractions, and many other experiments on life are heavily concentrated, and thus Anthropocenic signatures in the poor air quality, in the absence of water, in the hollowed out and polluted landscape, in the floods, for example, are profound, the reverberations of our capitalist lives. But it is also here, it's also here in these places of profound inequality, of profound environmental effects, where I've been taught histories that rupture those that have become hegemonic, and been compelled to engage in naming processes that center more clearly, more holistically, embodied vernaculars, which concomitantly prompt a more inclusive political impetus for our times. But before I continue, everyone knows what the Anthropocene is. I know I've gone a long way without asking people what it means. So ultimately, it registers the epoch in which humans have become a global geophysical force, and that the actions of man, and it's all is man, are shaping the Earth's strata more than anything else. Rather, they're the primary geological agents. And there are many names for the Anthropocene now as the people contest its depth, its inclusivity, its political imperatives, such as the Capitolocene, which we've talked about, the Plantationocene, the Chudrucene, I think is how you say Harry's proposition, the white supremacy scene, the medicine, many scenes. So there are many replacements to try and get to a politics that's not often captured by the Anthropocene. And to be sure, and as Yusuf suggests in a 2021 article, if the Anthropocene is an opportunity, as badly named as it is, to think about forms of geologic inscription within a larger field of geologic forces, then we might turn away from the monumental man as the authoring center in favor of a more exacting science of attribution that speaks to the interiorities and differences that diffract through our geologic lives. And this is what all of these names are trying to do. And certainly post its official recognition by the Anthropocene Working Group in 2016 as referencing the age after the Holocene, an emerging lexicon, and these are the words of Baldwin and Erickson, an emerging lexicon which seeks to acknowledge race as a central organizing category within this emerging historiography of the Anthropocene, and that establishes that the signature of the Anthropocene is a signature of racism, is increasing. So these lexicons are increasing. And while the Anthropocene offers, at the very least, despite these contestations, while it offers a moment to reflect, as mentioned earlier, it still obscures these many racialized realities. And so there are many contentions about it, that not all of us who are human, even if we talk about humans' footprint on the earth, there are many contentions. More particular to Kenya or Africa broadly, these elaborations have often not focused. If, according to Adada, they have provided a more comprehensive review of the impact of the Anthropocene on the Northern Hemisphere, with few systematic reviews of evidence of Anthropocene markers in Africa. So I agree that whiteness, and in the words of Baldwin and Erickson, whiteness has been the base principle for understanding environmental change, and thus other registers have not been valued. Reinscribing the undifferentiation of humanity or of anthropos immanent to the Anthropocene. I'm also attentive to how, while we may register the increased impact of anthropogenic signatures in aquatic life or agriculture or poaching in Kenya, there's not been enough attention to think about how the kinds of geology that urban bodies live. And so that's what I want to focus on now. And I know this is a long process, but that I'll focus on shortly. Look at how the kinds of geology that urban bodies live, and particularly those from the margins of Nairobi, where I've worked for the last 15 years or so. And so here I try and make visible their own systematic review of evidence for the Anthropocene and beyond. So Mathare residents have been facing, and we can go up a bit. So Mathare residents, you can see there. Mathare residents have been facing end times every day. Since its beginnings as a stone quarry, and I'm not sure you can see that from that landscape, but it began as a stone quarry in the early 1900s, and whose resources were mined to contribute to the expansion of a burgeoning colonial city. Its African residents actually lived in the hollowed out cave dwellings of the mine. Since this time, and perhaps from this provenance, Mathare has always been a settlement, in the words of White, of no legitimacy at all. When Africans were finally allowed to live in Nairobi, these slum residents did not fit the profile of good Christian loyalist natives who could be afforded some of the meager housing built for those who could embody this position. So who were the respectable Africans at that time who worked in the public service, or who were Christians, or who were not part of anti-colonial agitation. Rather, because of its affiliation to the Mau Mau or the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, because it really was the inhabitation of undesired ethnicities or of ungovernable lifestyles, whether it was the production of illegal alcohol, sometimes sex work and other informal economies, it was not seen in favorable light by either the colonial administration and subsequent post-colonial government. As a consequence, Mathare has always been a place to enact formal extinctions of various kinds. During a focus group one January afternoon early this year, I asked my young interlocutors what Mathare meant to them. This group, these interlocutors were primarily of a second generation of Mathare dwellers, and two of them were third generation and had young children who are also living here, demonstrating familial ties to this place for at least 8 years. While I was hoping to try and understand the ecological injustices they faced every day, their reflections on our present age of the Anthropocene. For them, anthropos had been waging many wars here for over the last century. Ultimately, the local Anthropocenic signatures range from endless detention, extortion, deprivation of hydraulic citizenship, and endless abuse. In the words of one of my youngest interlocutors, who we will call Mawe, He said, I want us as residents of Mathare to look at the issues facing us squarely. Let us be honest, Mathare is a modern day detention camp. In the same way today, living in the area is like living in a police state. The police stations around here, Pangani, Jonsaga, Mozaiga, and the one there, they are comparable to what were guard towers then in the colonial period, with police ready to shoot anyone trying to escape to change the situation. This is the structural violence that they have created. In the same way there was no water in the detention camps, the same situation is what faces us here today. There is no electricity power supplied here since the government has refused to supply power, as they say, that the connections here are all illegal connections. This is true, yes. Our electricity connections are illegal, but how would we otherwise survive without power? We connect them to survive. We feel that in the eyes of the government, we are considered damaged people. And you know, the most dangerous person is a damaged person because he has nothing to lose and will do anything to survive. And surviving is what they have been doing for over 100 years, making Mathare one of the oldest communities in Nairobi, even if it is barely referenced on the map of the city or even privy to basic services. They continue to endure countless evictions, countless fires, countless executions, enduring colonial trauma, and now articulated and exacerbated by a heightened environmental crisis. Certainly, no one I spoke to at this session, and even many others outside of this context in Kenya, had heard of the Anthropocene. Some of them had heard of climate change, partially, I presume, because in both English and Kiswahili, the term is self-explanatory, mabadiliko ya hali ya anga. But more importantly, they had felt it and had recognized it as related to the structural extinctions that they were already facing on a daily basis. Many felt colder in the winter, prompting pneumonia and flu, and exacerbating other conditions. They felt hotter when the even hotter sun than normal bore on their rusting metal roofs. It was evident in the ways that in which water was increasingly hard to find, or the garbage that was increasingly dumped in the area, effectively rearranging topography, of the powerful floods that came, propelled by heavy rains and given license by the soil erosion of slum riverbanks and flooded gutters upstreams, carrying a pastiche of household and industrial waste, flood torrents that tumbled houses, lifted children and adults, taking them kilometers from their homes, pronouncing death. Connected to these geographies, in rural areas, uncles shook their heads in sorrow as they told me of the dry maize crop, their staple food. In the same area, a young man spoke about how they could no longer find certain grains and vegetables, indigenous foods that had disappeared within only 37 years, or within his 37 years on earth. And so they had to make do with whatever could manage to pierce through the soil and stand strong in the face of erratic rain and sun, as well as unexpected disease. And even locusts were what they were facing due to this current environmental crises. Locusts, biblical level disasters that took over the sky suddenly, as if it were end times, and which could clear acres and acres of crops in days. So what vernaculars did they offer to register and account for these environmental crises that, while seemingly pan-human affliction, come from an enduring necropolitical governance? A rural peer from Kilifi spoke of the abandonment of cultural shrines and the large processes of kinspeople heading for the churches, turning their backs on traditional temples, habitually cultivated in and together with forests. In this whole area, he said melancholically, there are less than 12 shrines left. Back in Mathare, and back to this focus group, some interlocutors shared a number of perspectives to give cause and effect to the now more pronounced ecological crises. One interlocutor shared, I believe the more the population grows and the more we continue to cut down trees and the more our needs will continue to increase. Pollution from the industries will increase as they produce more and more items. We will continue to want things like cars. So it's a struggle. This is what is causing all of these problems. So it's talking about, in many ways, neo-Malthusian perspectives that land in Africa: overpopulation, but also consumption and pollution. The second interlocutor said, look at what is happening in Africa. We have farms for horticulture that grow flowers, and that's exported to Europe, because we can't afford flowers, buying flowers in Kenya. So we have farms for horticulture that grows flowers. The people working there are exploited. They spend the day working in the greenhouses where they work with poisonous chemicals. The chemicals used, their runoff goes and it spoils the river. But who is it who owns these farms here in Africa? I have worked in this industry, and so I can speak authoritatively when I say the workers do not benefit at all. When I worked there, I felt I was so exploited that it affected my physical and emotional well-being. The only people who benefit are the capitalist owners of the farms who are not citizens of the countries where they farm. In my view, the world is being destroyed for the many so that the few people can benefit. I tell you about working in this industry, I can only describe it as slavery. The workers are exploited and only get paid crumbs. The sad reality is when the worker retires, his child takes over his job. And so you find that generation after generation continue to suffer. And a third interlocutor said, I would like to explain that me, apart from being an activist, an artist, and a scholar, we are all taxonomists. This means that we are people trying to identify what our struggles are. An example, how do we identify class struggles? The issues of extrajudicial killings, matters such as ecological justice. We have identified them as coming from the structural violences that face us here. So in these narrations, from these three interlocutors, they upheld some of the popularized global causes of climate change, so pollution, overpopulation, but they also gestured towards both their centrality and distance from the causes of anthropogenic signatures, their labor power as the worker, as enslaved, which is used to fuel industries of racial capitalism that exacerbate what are seen as our human footprint. These words index both their existence within their hinterlands and centers of what we call the Anthropocene, and register their actual positions as geological agents. They also, in these narrations, also include a young man, as I said earlier, or offered earlier, lamenting the absence of shrines, so pointing towards the pursuit of Christianity as a cause of this. And in thinking with spirits, as this person was doing and using the word of Alain Pessin, that narrative indicates other times and other forces that are not included in mainstream discussions on the Anthropocene. In these situated reflections, vernaculars of environmental change, and again, note that the environment is many things, narratives of geological time in outlaw frames, they offered more nuanced situational causes, effects, and chronologies dated both before and beyond the Industrial Revolution, often seen as a watershed moment for our present age. In naming their experiences in their own words, they, who constitute humanity's outside, narrated their ongoing corporeal experiences, but also inhabited other possibilities, other imaginaries of human life. As the final section of this presentation, I discuss how by taking power to taxonomize, and here I use taxonomize just to name, just as Anthropocene is a name which comes with its own cultural baggage and its own propositions, then naming processes also, what one, in the words of Maui, was said, identify what our struggles are, allows that they inhabit these other these other imaginaries. And so in the final section of this presentation, I also show how this naming process, this taxonomizing, this allowing that we are all taxonomists, provides space these interlocutors and many Mathare residents to resist, as they have always done, geological foreclosures imminent to the Anthropocene. And as they do this, and in continuing to seek to do this, I hope I can reuse this quote by Lancione and Simon. They engage in a tempo beyond resilience. Certainly the survival they talk about shows differentiation in geological life, or what Yusuf calls our geological lives, not just in terms of how they experience its deeply race, class, and gender biases, but also because, and borrowing from Davidson and Da Silva, this differentiation articulates a mode of maroon survivalism in which the apocalypse is an event to be endured and escaped, rather than fatalistically expected or infinitely delayed. In other words, they are hopeful taxonomists. Certainly imminent to the discussion of the Anthropocene are these apocalyptic warnings of catastrophe, of end times for all, no matter who caused it, except for perhaps the lone geologists who may survive to present a message of warning from previous ages. But while the reflections from Mathare, this outlaw space, spoke about the many grave and sinister dangers of colonized ecologies, existences of those who, in the words of Alain Pesant, have been living the Anthropocene for years, they also reached forth for possibilities, engaging in naming praxis, both material and enunciatory, to truly inhabit, regardless of the futilities and lack of futurities implicit in what is held as our present geological age. In 2019, in Mathare, young people in a group called the Mathare Green Movement did a tree census in their slum. Basically, they counted all the trees in this settlement of 3 square kilometers and a population of roughly 210 people. And this 3 square kilometers, they counted only 200 trees. And this, they made exceptions also to include bushes. So really, there were barely any trees in Mathare. Having found these only 200 trees, they then launched a bid to grow trees in this neighborhood. And this is one attempt. So they were growing trees in this neighborhood that has long been the subject of both colonial and post-colonial environmental apartheid. But they were not engaging in a bourgeois environmentalism. This was, growing these trees is a material praxis to name, just like the Anthropocene has been named by geologists. So trees were grown for shade against the hotter sun, so that young people can get, they were also grown so that young people can get used to seeing trees and to normalize them in this context. But they were also grown to bring fruit trees so people could eat, and medicine so that people can treat themselves. These trees were also grown to memorialize those who were killed during ongoing interconnected extinctions waged on a daily basis. Trees planted to remember young people who had been killed by police violence and other related phenomena. They were planted so that they could memorialize those who had gone or had been taken away, disappeared by the violences of the Anthropocenes that are both fast and slow. Many of the pieces I read about the Anthropocene talk of the impending doom, the disaster we made, we, in brackets, in quotation marks, and our inability to avoid it. The very real rising temperatures, the melting ice caps, the glaciers, the drying up of River Pole, the wildfires, and in Kenya, the drought, the rising lake levels. But as Alain Pesant writes, Black people stripped down to bare life have learned over the centuries to embed their relationship to Earth in underground fugitive gestures of speaking, moving, sounding in the various rhythms of daily life. Their relationship to space becomes marked by stolen life. This place, a former quarry, literally brought into being by the disemboweling of strata, and whose residents have been navigating annihilation of different types for centuries, have somehow still managed to engage in many fervent, imperfect, and even mundane acts to respond to the ecological losses of home and elsewhere, actions for home that see them steal a little bit more of life. This tree census that they conducted is but one small example of countless other actions over the last few years that show, even if our southern margins have lost much and will lose more, that here the Anthropocene has not proposed the embrace of futures. It cannot. It's just another proposed extinction. As young man shared during our focus group, when you live the life of an outlaw, you must escape the situation and bring change to your life. That is how we have been surviving in Mathare, as everything that happens here is illegal. What remains is for us to keep going, is for us to keep looking for ways to bring about change in the ways that we live. As I said earlier, none of these interlocutors had ever heard of the Anthropocene, but through their embodied experiences in the narrations of ecological loss, of the structural violence that faces us here, they became what that interlocutor referred to as taxonomists. Through their situated references of wage slavery, desires for consumption, racial capitalism, dry maize, locusts, abandoned shrines, police killing, a lack of electricity. Through these situated references, they brought together events that were both signified and were signifiers of this particular geological age, but for them which go beyond that, go beyond this declaration of an epoch, because these experiences go beyond what Besant refers to as a just declared Anthropocene. And what do these vernaculars bring to the global discussions of the Anthropocene? As expressed by organic taxonomists who assert against their marginalizations how they fit into patterns of power, capital, and nature, these vernaculars contribute to much more complexity to the origin stories of an Anthropocene that is said to have been birthed in the time of the steam engine. In their role as taxonomists, they identify systems of relationships that chronicle the long durée of colonial exploitation, the psychic lives of extractions that propel populations to turn from their gods, the related police killings and ecological injustices, and the desperate realities of future generations of what Moore calls cheap nature. Above all, they help us continue giving face to the many ways people who are not always the anthropos have been reflecting on and responding to all of the Anthropocenes and extinctions they have been expected to live, and that include and go beyond our present geological moment. These outlaw nouns and praxis are offered from places that are very far from our maybe the climate conference tables or the boardrooms of the Anthropocene working group. They're very far also from the geological laboratories of habitual northern knowledge centers. But through their liminality, they do what Lancione and Simone refer to as theorizing structural change from the multiple ontologies of the everyday counter-political. I began this talk by quoting a Kikuyu proverb that says, "Neither the earth nor sky know what the other will do." And despite the colonial trauma and colonial strata, these outlaw vernaculars remain hopeful. Whether they're enough to hold off what we are facing is unknown, but so is the relationship between the earth and the sky. Thank you. I guess I should say